The kill order came down at 0347, and by 0352 the sky above the Karelian shelf had gone completely, unnervingly silent. Not quiet. Silent. There's a difference, and any pilot who's been in a real shooting war knows it in their chest rather than their ears. A specific hollowness, the way the comms suddenly breathe wrong, like a sleeping person whose rhythm shifts just before they wake up screaming. Captain Maya Reyes felt it before her instruments confirmed it. She'd been flying the Sabre 9 long enough that the aircraft's alerts felt like extensions of her own nervous system, and when the encrypted UHF channels collapsed one after another, not degrading, not fading, but collapsing, like floors giving way in a burning building, she didn't curse or punch her cockpit glass. She just exhaled through her nose and did three things in rapid, practiced sequence. She cut her active radar emissions, she killed the IFF transponder, and she looked out the window. A habit that saved her life approximately 4 seconds later. The Vel'kaari strike package came in from the northeast at Mach 6.2, which humans didn't technically have a designation for yet because nothing human flew that fast inside an atmosphere without catching fire. Except the Vel'kaari apparently didn't worry much about the physics of catching fire. Their interceptors were shaped like elongated teardrops made of something that looked obsidian from distance and copper green up close. And they moved through air the way hot wire moves through wax, cleanly, impossibly, without any visible concession to the concept of drag. There were 11 of them. Maya was alone. She rolled hard left, pulling 6 Gs she hadn't planned for. And the Sabre 9 complained in every strut and weld line as she dove below the cloud deck into the roiling gray murk of a Baltic storm front. The Vel'kaari interceptors didn't follow. Not immediately. They pulled up and fanned out above the clouds in a textbook containment pattern, cutting off altitude escape, and Maya understood in about half a second what they were doing. They were herding, patient as farmers. They wanted her to burn her fuel running, or they wanted her to climb back up where they could see her, or, most likely, they wanted her to try the radio and light herself up like a very stupid candle. She didn't try the radio. What she did instead, and she'd explain this later, to the debrief recorder, in a voice she worked hard to keep flat and professional, was she thought about her grandfather. Specifically, she thought about the summer she turned 12, when Abuelo Reyes sat her down in his kitchen in San Antonio with a legal pad, a pencil, and the patience of a man who had spent 30 years as a Navy radio man and taught her Morse code the old way. Not with software, not with an app, with dots and dashes scratched on paper until her wrist ached, while he read aloud from memory, his coffee going cold on the table between them. He'd made her do it until she could receive 20 words per minute with her eyes closed. Because someday, he'd told her, in Spanish, in that particular tone he used when something was a certainty rather than a prediction, the machines will fail. And that day, you'll be glad your head still works. She'd thought it was charming, eccentric old man stuff. She thought about him now, in the dark belly of a Baltic storm cloud, with 11 alien interceptors hunting her overhead and every electromagnetic communication system she owned reduced to elegant, hostile static, and she started doing math. The Sabre 9's weapons loadout included 2 LAMP 7 target designation lasers, typically used for painting ground targets for smart munitions, or for close-range identification in optical blackout conditions. They were coherent, tight-beam, low-divergence emitters rated to approximately 14 kilometers in clear air. In heavy cloud, maybe 4. Maybe, and they were, critically, not radio waves. They were light. Photons, not the kind of thing a signal-jamming suite designed around electromagnetic suppression would even think to look for, let alone block. She had no idea if any of her wingmates were still alive. She had no idea if anyone was in range. She had no idea, honestly, if this was going to accomplish anything except make her feel less alone in the dark. Which, yeah, okay, maybe that was its own kind of reason. She armed LAMP 7 port side, angled it 14 degrees up and forward toward where Bravo flight's last known position had been, and she began to key. ... SOS first. Because that felt right. Because her grandfather would have started with SOS. Then she began to talk. Approximately 340 kilometers above and to the northeast, aboard the Vel'kaari command lattice vessel Serikal, which translates imperfectly as persistent inquiry and more literally as the thing that keeps asking, a sensor analyst named Thurivel was having the worst professional day of her moderately long life. The mission had been straightforward. It was always straightforward until it wasn't. The humans' electromagnetic dependency was their most exploitable vulnerability, and the Serical's suppression array had performed exactly as specified. Total RF blackout across 4,000 square kilometers, which should have rendered the surviving human aircraft isolated, blind, and incapable of coordinated response. 11 interceptors to mop up whatever the initial strike had missed. Clean, efficient, the kind of outcome that looked good in the archival reports. And then Theravel's passive optical array, which was not the sensor system anyone was paying attention to, detected something extraordinary, a pulse sequence. In laser bandwidth light, coming from inside the cloud layer, she almost didn't flag it. The passive optical sensors were there for atmospheric calibration, mainly, and a coherent light source inside a storm cloud was, well, it was strange, but strange in a boring way, like maybe equipment malfunction, like maybe electrical discharge, like maybe a dozen things that weren't her department. She had a suppression array to monitor. She had 11 interceptors to track. She had the pulse sequence repeated, and then it changed. Theravel had spent 11 years studying human communications doctrine. She spoke 2 human languages with grammatical competency and a third, English, well enough to dream in it occasionally, which she did not mention to her superiors because it sounded unsettlingly like assimilation. She knew human radio protocols, encryption schemas, visual recognition signals, everything the Vel'kaari intelligence establishment had been able to catalog in 4 decades of observation and 3 years of active conflict. She did not immediately recognize what she was seeing. The pulses were irregular in duration. Short, long, short, long, long. Clustered and then spaced. There was a rhythm to it, unmistakably intentional. She could see that within the first 8 seconds. But the encoding was nothing she'd ever catalogued in the human systems archive. No frequency hopping, no spread spectrum, no digital compression artifact she could identify. Just light, going on and off, in patterns that felt almost like Supervisor Veldon, she said, keeping her voice controlled and professionally neutral. I need a cross-referencing query to Human Communication Archive 7 through 22, specifically any pre-digital, low-technology signaling methods, optical, non-spectral. The supervisor gave her a look that communicated approximately what most supervisors everywhere communicate when a junior analyst makes a strange request at an operationally sensitive moment. Something between really now and this better not be what I think it is. The target aircraft, Theravel added. It's talking. Just not with radio. 2,300 meters below in that churning gray, Maya had made contact. She knew it before she could decode the response. Actually, because the response was a specific thing, 2 long pulses and a pause, repeated 3 times, which was not Morse code but was the human military visual blink acknowledgement signal that predated Morse code by about a century and had been part of basic aviation training since before anyone currently flying had been born. Someone had seen her signal and sent back the one thing they were sure she'd recognize regardless of whether the whole Morse thing had landed. I hear you. Go ahead. The voice that eventually came, not a voice, she had to keep reminding herself. It was light. It was pulses. It was her grandfather's kitchen and a legal pad. Belonged to Lieutenant Commander Dev Anand, callsign Pilgrim, who she had not known was in her sector and who had apparently been running dark and silent in a drainage ditch of a ravine at 50 meters altitude since the jamming began, using his topography to mask himself from the Vel'kaari interceptor's downward-looking sensors. Anand was good. He was genuinely one of the 3 or 4 best pilots Maya had ever flown with, which was a category she was reluctant to admit included anyone else, being human and competitive. He was also from Chennai, and sometimes used idioms that left her briefly parsing, and on one memorable occasion had compared a difficult approach to threading a needle through a mango, which, okay, she'd got there eventually. Their conversation, in Morse, conducted at about 12 words per minute because that was the fastest either of them could manage at this kind of stress level, went roughly like this. How many alive? Unnud. Found Harker 4 minutes ago, same freak. She has 2 lamp emitters, 3 of them, 3 Sabre 9s in a cloud deck, talking in light, being hunted by 11 alien interceptors that had jammed everything they understood about how aircraft communicated. Maya felt something odd happen in her sternum. Not exactly hope, because hope was too soft for what this situation called for, but something functional and sharp, like her body switching modes. Ordnance count, HR Kerr. For Hellfire's full load. Me, too. You? 6 Hellfires, 2 Slammers. Lamp 7 both sides. Okay, Dev sent, and she could almost hear his voice in the cadence of his keying. Some people had that, a rhythm in their code that felt like them. Play N? She was already working the plan. Had been since the moment she'd sent the first SOS. The Vel'kaari interceptors would have to come down into the cloud to flush them eventually. They couldn't loiter forever at high altitude burning fuel, and they'd already been up there 7 minutes, which in combat terms was enough time to have already asked someone for guidance and to have been told to stop being careful and start being decisive. When they came down, the cloud would be to Maya's advantage and not theirs. Vel'kaari's sensor suites were optimized for space and high-altitude atmospheric environments. Their close-range, high-clutter performance in dense particulate conditions was, based on captured technical data and about a dozen engagements, significantly degraded. They were fast and they were accurate at range. They were less fast and considerably less accurate in a furball at 300 knots in zero visibility. Humans, on the other hand, had been doing exactly that since 1917, over France, in biplanes made of canvas and stupid optimism, and the institutional memory of how to fight confused and close and dirty was embedded in every aspect of how Maya and Dev and whoever Harker was had been trained. She laid it out in dots and dashes. The plan she'd assembled from instinct and calculation and 20 years of aviation violence, a triangulated ambush. 3 aircraft at 3 different altitudes in the cloud, using Lamp 7 lasers not for target designation, but for coordination. A 3-way optical communications web, invisible to every sensor the Vel'kaari would think to use, letting 3 isolated pilots fight as a single coordinated unit inside the jamming bubble their enemy had built specifically to prevent that. Dev's response, when it came, was just 4 characters. Well, which was how Dev Anand said, "This is insane, but I respect it." She'd learned over 18 months of flying with him, so she took it as a yes. Aboard the Sherikal, Thurivel had been working for 11 minutes to decode the optical signal, and in that 11 minutes the operational picture had fundamentally changed in ways she was beginning to understand would reverberate beyond this engagement. The encoding was in the archive. Of course it was in the archive. It was in the section of the archive that nobody looked at because it was stamped pre-digital/historical/obsolete, a categorization that was making her increasingly want to have a conversation with whoever had written the archival metadata policy. The encoding was called Morse code. It had been invented by humans in 1837. In 1837, that was, Thurivel paused with the calculation for just a moment. That was over 200 human years ago, roughly equivalent to 6 or 7 Vel'kaari generations, a span of time during which her own civilization had advanced from early atmospheric flight to interstellar travel. Humans, in that same span, had gone from the telegraph to nuclear fission to genetic engineering to faster-than-light navigation. And when Thurivel's suppression array had destroyed every modern communication system in 4,000 square kilometers, when it had reached out and killed every sophisticated frequency and encrypted channel the humans possessed, one of their pilots had dusted off a 2-century-old encoding system and started talking in light. Because light wasn't radio, and nobody had thought to suppress light. She'd flagged this for Supervisor Vel'dan with a priority rating that would in retrospect prove insufficient. What she hadn't yet done was fully decode the content of what she was receiving. The cross-referencing algorithm was running. She was watching the preliminary outputs, and what she was seeing was not panic, was not a distress beacon, was not a pilot narrating their own final moments into the void. It was a tactical plan, a coherent, geometrically specific, operationally sophisticated tactical plan, developed and communicated in a dead encoding system, conducted via repurposed target designation lasers inside a meteorological barrier between 3 human pilots who had been functionally isolated from each other and from any command authority for over 12 minutes. "Vel'dan," she said, and her voice this time was not controlled and professionally neutral. It was the voice she used when she was genuinely alarmed, which was a voice she rarely needed. "I need to reach the intercept wing, right now. They need to abort the cloud penetration." The supervisor looked up from a different display. "The intercept package is already committed. They crossed the cloud boundary 40 seconds ago." Thurivel turned back to her display, watched the decoded text resolving, read the part that said triangulated ambush. Then, she said, very carefully, We have a problem. The first explosion, a human hellfire connecting with Vel'kaari interceptor hull at approximately 200 meters altitude in zero visibility cloud, registered on the Seri-Kal's passive sensors 4.3 seconds later. The second registered 1.1 seconds after that, and then it stopped being a count Thurivel could follow. The clouds kept their secrets well. That was the thing nobody thought about. Going in, the way weather owns its interior, how a storm system at 2,000 meters is an entirely different universe from what it looks like on radar, on imaging, on the clean abstracted geometry of a tactical display. Inside it, visibility collapsed to maybe 40 meters in any direction, and the moisture hit the canopy in sheets that made the whole world feel pressurized and intimate, like being inside something alive. Maya had fought in weather before. She had not fought in weather quite like this, by which she meant not the meteorological conditions, which were severe but manageable, but the circumstance of it. 3 pilots talking in light. 11 alien aircraft stumbling through zero visibility with sensor suites built for the clarity of upper atmosphere. No support, no controller, no data link, no radio, just her hands and her eyes and the cold, specific knowledge of what she'd talked Dev and Harker into. She found her first target by sound, actually, before she found it by sight. The Vel'kaari interceptors made a noise in atmosphere that human aerospace engineers had spent several very disturbed weeks analyzing after the first close encounters, a kind of resonant harmonic hum generated by their propulsion interaction with air molecules, pitched at around 340 Hz, which was unfortunately close to the frequency of a human male's speaking voice, so the first people who heard it up close had this instinctive, deeply unsettling sense that something very large was talking to them. The mission psychologists had a whole working group on it. She'd read the report. She remembered thinking it sounded like bureaucratic overreaction. Standing in the memory of that report now, listening to the hum materializing out of the cloud, 12 o'clock and slightly low, she amended that assessment. It was legitimately unnerving. Her throat tightened the way throats do when the animal part of the brain notices something before the reasoning part has finished its argument. She fired at 0.5 kilometer, which in air combat terms was embarrassingly close, nearly point blank. The Hellfire was not actually designed to be fired at this range. It needed acquisition time, needed distance to arm properly. And she'd offset the targeting parameters 4 hours ago during a maintenance window she'd used for exactly this kind of contingency thinking, because she was the sort of person who spent maintenance windows thinking about edge cases, which her last 3 squadron commanders had called either her greatest asset or her most exhausting quality, depending on the month. The missile did what she'd calculated. The Vel'kaari interceptor did not do what it would have preferred. The fireball in the cloud was something she felt more than saw. A pressure pulse. A flash of orange that turned the murk briefly amber and made her eyes react before her mind could tell them not to. And then she was through the debris field and climbing and keying lamp 7 in the sequence she and Dev had agreed on. 232 meaning splash 1 re-engaging, clear right. Dev's response came back almost instantly. 114 meaning splash 2, watch your 6, they're adapting. Adapting? Of course they were adapting. She'd have been worried if they weren't, would have felt like she was fighting something dumb, which was its own kind of terrifying, like winning a chess game against someone who's asleep. The Vel'kaari were not dumb. They were reorganizing in real time inside the cloud, trying to re-establish unit cohesion, probably screaming at each other in their own comms about what was happening, why they couldn't get a targeting lock, why the humans were apparently everywhere and nowhere at once. What they didn't understand, and this was the thing, this was the heart of the whole situation, was that the 3 Saber 9s were coordinating so precisely that they were functionally behaving like a single 6-eyed organism. Every contact one of them made, they reported to the other 2 in light before acting. Every vector change, every altitude shift, every hellfire expended. The information loop was slower than data link by about 400%, because Morse at 12 words a minute versus digital telemetry at megabits per second is a comparison that only makes sense if you remember that 12 words a minute is infinitely faster than total communications silence, which had been the alternative. The Vel'kaari interceptors had been built to counter a networked, technology-dependent fighting force. They had not been built to counter 3 humans in a cloud talking to each other in 19th-century light signals. There is something almost philosophically savage about that gap. Thurivel would write about it later, in a report that would be classified for 6 years and then become required reading at 3 different Vel'kaari military academies. that the humans' most effective weapon in the Karelian engagement was not their ordnance, not their aircraft performance, not even their individual piloting skill. It was their institutional memory. They carried 200 years of communications redundancy in their heads like load-bearing architecture, accessed it under extreme stress without apparent hesitation, and applied it in a context its inventors could not have remotely envisioned. She wrote, "We suppressed what they built. We could not suppress what they remembered." That line would be quoted in Vel'kaari think pieces for decades. The engagement lasted, start to finish, 19 minutes. 7 of 11 Vel'kaari interceptors were destroyed. 3 disengaged and climbed back above the cloud deck, which was tactically defensible. They'd lost too many to maintain effective suppression, and holding the high ground while the situation was reassessed made operational sense. The 11th one Maya hit twice and it went down spinning into the shelf below, and she hoped its pilot survived the ejection if the Vel'kaari had ejection systems, which she wasn't actually sure about and thought briefly, with a strange twist of feeling that she probably should be sure about. She climbed back above the clouds at 0431. Dev was 3 kilometers north, his Sabre 9 looking like it had argued with a very large piece of shrapnel and not entirely one but flying. Harker, Lieutenant Jesse Harker, whom Maya would not actually meet in person for another 6 weeks, was 5 kilometers east, clean, no visible damage, and when Maya keyed her lamp 7 in the standard post-engagement ID pattern, Harker came back with a sequence Maya didn't immediately recognize until she decoded it. It was Morse for Abuelo would be proud, which meant Dev had apparently told her where this whole plan had come from. Maya sat with that for a moment, something warm and aching in her sternum that she was not prepared to examine in detail at 0431, having just survived something that probably had a name in the statistical literature under extremely improbable outcome. She keyed back. "Don't push it," and she turned the Sabre 9 south toward the Talon approach corridor. Lamp 7 still warm, radio still dead, flying home in silence through a sky she'd kept. Aboard the Cicala, the silence that followed the engagement was different in quality from the silence that preceded it. Before, it had been the silence of a hunting predator. Now it was something more complex and less comfortable. The silence of a researcher who has just read a result that doesn't fit the model, who has to decide whether to question the result or question the model, and who already knows, in the part of themselves that processes truth before language gets there, which one of those choices is correct. Vel'dan sat at her station for a long time without speaking. Thurivel let her. There wasn't much to say that the sensor logs didn't already say more precisely. Eventually the supervisor asked, "How old is Morse code?" "Human year 1837, Thurivel said. By their calendar." Another silence, and it was in the archive, in the pre-digital section, marked obsolete. Vel'dan made a sound that translated as something between "of course" and "I should have known," with a light seasoning of "I'd like to speak with whoever categorized that." Pull everything in that section, everything marked pre-digital, primitive, obsolete, abandoned, superseded, all of it. "I want an analysis of every method humans have ever used to communicate that doesn't depend on electromagnetic propagation." Thurivel was already pulling it. She'd started 10 minutes ago, while the last of the Sabre 9s was still climbing out of the cloud. The list, as it turned out, was longer than either of them had expected. Significantly longer, because humans were. It emerged, not for the first time in Vel'kaari experience, but with a vividness that this engagement had given the quality of a revelation. Humans were extraordinarily reluctant to actually abandon anything that had once worked. They layered new systems over old ones like sediment over bedrock, kept the old knowledge alive in academies and training programs and grandmothers' kitchens in San Antonio, maintained an infrastructure of obsolete methodologies that had no modern application right up until the moment when someone jammed their radios and suddenly the obsolete thing was the only thing standing between function and silence. Drum signals, smoke signals, semaphore flags, heliograph mirrors, signal lamps, chemical trail markers, acoustic codes, messenger animals. They still occasionally trained those, Thurivel found, tucked into a military research program that must have seemed like a nostalgic curiosity until approximately right now. Pattern-stamped physical media that could survive electromagnetic pulse, not based recording systems derived from pre-technological cultures. Techniques for communicating through literature, through music, through the deliberate arrangement of objects in space, and underlying all of it, penetrating all of it like a single organizing principle, the absolute conviction, apparently bred into human military culture at a cellular level, that communications will fail, and you had better have 14 backup plans, and you had better know all 14 in your hands and not just in your machines. Supervisor, Tharaful said, about 2 hours into the analysis, I want to flag something. Go! This isn't a vulnerability in our suppression doctrine. I mean, she paused, organizing the thought. It is, technically. The optical channel gap is real and we need to address it. But the deeper issue is something the archive has been undervaluing. We have 4 decades of human communications intelligence and we've been almost entirely focused on their electronic systems. We have excellent data on their frequency usage, their encryption schemas, their satellite infrastructure. We have almost nothing on the pre-digital layer, because we categorized it as obsolete. Vel'dan waited. They didn't, Thurivel said. They kept it all, and I think the reason they kept it, and I want to be precise here because this matters for how we model them going forward. The reason isn't nostalgia, or inefficiency, or failure to modernize. It's that they've been in enough situations where everything failed that they've developed a cultural reflex against over-reliance on any single technology stack. They over-provision for failure, dramatically, as a matter of identity. She pulled up a human text on the secondary display, an old one, military history, 20th century, and translated the relevant passage. An army that relies on a single supply line has already surrendered a crucial part of its fate to the enemy. Redundancy is not waste. Redundancy is the acknowledgement that the universe does not care about your operational plan. They've known this for hundreds of years, Thurivel said. We've been reading it in their historical texts. We just weren't treating it as a capability assessment, we were treating it as philosophy. Vel'dan was quiet for a moment. Then, write that up. All of it. Priority classification. Command distribution. Yes, Supervisor. Thurivel started the report structure. Then, because she was tired and because the day had earned the right to a little candor. Can I ask, do you think they knew, the pilots? Do you think they understood what they demonstrated? Vel'dan considered that. I think the pilot who built the plan knew she was improvising. I doubt she understood the scope of what she was demonstrating. Thurivel thought about a human in a cockpit in a Baltic storm, reaching 200 years back into her grandfather's kitchen, talking in light in the dark. Maybe that's the most alarming part, she said. They improvise things that change doctrine, and they don't even know they're doing it. 6 weeks later, in a debrief room in Tallinn that smelled strongly of burnt coffee, and that specific institutional carpet smell found universally in every military facility Maya had ever occupied on 3 continents. She sat across from a woman from Naval Intelligence whose rank insignia Maya kept forgetting to look at directly, and answered questions about the Karelian engagement for 4 hours. Most of the questions were technical. Ordnance loads, approach vectors, communications protocol, how long it had taken her to adapt the LAMP 7 system, what the optical range limitations were, whether she'd had any training in laser optical communications or if this was field improvisation. Field improvisation, she said. Mostly, the intelligence officer wrote something, and the Morse code proficiency. My grandfather taught me. When I was a kid, Maya paused, looked at the wall. There was nothing on the wall except a water stain shaped somewhat like Lake Michigan, and she'd been staring at it on and off all morning without meaning to. He was a Navy radio man. He thought it was important. Why? She considered the question. He used to say the machines remember what you put in them. But the machines can be taken away. What's in your head can't. Another pause. He thought there was wisdom in knowing how people talk to each other before electricity made it easy. Because electricity can be disrupted. Because the enemy can jam your radio. But they can't. I mean, he never said this out loud, but I think what he meant was, they can't jam what you remember. She finally looked at the intelligence officer directly. He made me learn it. I thought it was just something grandfathers do. The officer put down her stylus. It was a small, specific gesture. The kind that means I am about to tell you something and I want you to hear it without the distraction of me performing any other action simultaneously. Captain Reyes, she said. I've spent 30 years in signals intelligence. I want to be careful about overstatement. So I'm going to say this precisely. What you did in the Karelian engagement may be the most consequential single act of communications improvisation in the history of modern air combat. She paused. The Vel'kaari have been intercepting our communications for 4 decades. They built a suppression system predicated on a complete understanding of how we communicate. That system worked, and you broke it with something they weren't looking for because they decided it was dead. Maya didn't say anything for a moment. The water stain on the wall was definitely more like Superior than Michigan, actually, now that she looked at it longer. My grandfather, she said finally, would find this very funny. He passed away 3 years ago. Yeah, I'm sorry. He would have laughed his head off, Maya said, and the thing in her chest was grief and pride and a kind of love that didn't have a clean name, the love for dead people who were still apparently fighting in your corner. He'd have said something like, "See? I told you." He always wanted to say that. He was very good at it. The intelligence officer smiled. It was a real smile, not a professional one. Well, consider it said. The Vel'kaari report, when it was eventually declassified and shared as part of a prisoner exchange that included, somewhat surreally, a copy of the Serikal sensor logs of the entire Karelian engagement, ran to 340 pages, and was translated into 11 human languages within a month. Most military readers focused on the tactical analysis, the operational doctrine recommendations, the specific assessment of Vel'kaari suppression system vulnerabilities. But there was a section near the end, written by a junior analyst whose name appeared in the Vel'kaari notation system as a phoneme cluster that human linguists rendered as something between Thurivel and Serivel, and eventually just called T, who had apparently been the first to decode Maya's transmissions, and who had written something that got passed around informally, outside the formal distribution channels, in the kind of way that things get passed around when they've said something true in a way that people want to share. It was a single paragraph. The translation read, "We have spent 4 decades studying how humanity communicates and built our doctrine on the conclusion that we understood them. What the Karelian engagement demonstrated is that we had been studying what they communicate, not how deep the roots of communication go in them. We jammed their radios, we destroyed their satellite links. We believed we had silenced them. We had not understood that a species which survived centuries of war before electricity existed does not depend on electricity for its will to speak. A human in absolute silence will find the light. They always find the light. This is not a tactical insight. This is a statement about their nature that we have systematically failed to account for, and the accounting begins now." Maya read that paragraph for the first time on a Tuesday in February, at her kitchen table, on a morning when the coffee was still hot and the light was coming in sideways through the blinds the way winter light does at high latitudes, where it never quite commits to being direct about anything. She read it twice. Then she set down her tablet and looked out the window at the gray morning sky, which was full of clouds, and which was, for the moment, quiet. She thought, "Abuelo, you absolute legend." She thought, "I told you the machines can fail." She thought, in the dots and dashes she still ran reflexively sometimes when her mind needed to be somewhere particular. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The sky stayed gray, and soft, and full of things that light could travel through. She drank her coffee. She went on,